Hello friends, I'm Dina from TiinasDiary and I'm hosting a 4-part workshop for Strathmore all about gouache landscapes inspired by our seasons. Today in the second lesson we are painting a warm summer sunset landscape. In my spring lesson we used a very light and cool color palette, but since we're focusing on summer today we are diving into the warm golden tones of a summer sunset, and I personally love how this painting turned out and I hope you also like following along. Like in all of our 4 classes, we will be using the Strathmore 500 series ready cut hot press watercolor paper. I have the 5 by 7 inches size, but feel free to make this painting in any scale you want. I'm using the Princeton Velvetouch brushes and I'm mostly using the same brushes as in the first lesson, but they are all listed on the screen. I'm using gouache tubes from Maimeri and the exact shades I was using are titanium white, black, bluish violet, ultramarine deep, primary red magenta, scarlet, yellow ochre, lemon yellow, and olive green. Along with these supplies, I also used washi tape, paper towel, of course water for my paints, and a palette for mixing my colors. We are again starting with washi tape and then the sketch. For this painting, I first defined the horizon line, marked the center of the page, and then sketched the pathway. By the way, if you want some more help with your sketch or painting, you can take a screenshot from the beginning of this video where you can see the finished painting. Along the pathway, I also sketched some clouds in the sky and the tree line behind the field. Before we start mixing the paints, I'm going to make an underpainting. For it, I mixed yellow ochre with a lot of water to create a very see-through, watery, warm-toned underpainting that I coated the whole surface with. I always get questions about underpainting. I don't always use it, but especially with these very warm paintings, it comes handy. It helps with finding the correct colors on top, and in situations where your entire sheet isn't covered, instead of this very stark and distracting white showing through, it's going to be a color that overall fits the tone of your finished painting. Underpainting isn't necessary, but I've enjoyed using it. After the underpainting layer, we are starting by mixing the colors for the sky. In my painting, we have a purple blue toned sky and underneath a very warm toned layer of fluffy clouds. I know clouds can sound very intimidating, but in this painting, they're going to be very loose and minimal on any sharper details. I started by adding the orange sliver of color on top of the horizon line with white, lemon yellow, yellow ochre, and magenta, and then I started adding some more red and purple as we were going up in the cloud. I'm using a Filbert brush that usually lets me be more loose and messy with adding color and blending, but I was also using a size 6 round brush as well, just kind of loosely adding the colors on the clouds. I started by adding some shades for the cloud to map out the shape and colors a bit, but before I finished them, I added colors to the sky. I actually decided to make this a bit more vibrant later, as it's sometimes a bit tricky to choose an exact right color at this stage yet. I mixed in white, ultramarine deep, and black to create this more grayish blue, but again, I will add some more vibrancy to it later. I added a little gradient to the sky as well, blending the darker blue into a lighter color with white. Again, I like blending the most with these Filbert brushes. Usually the gradients are the easiest when you are blending the color by lightening it. I actually think I wasn't that good with gradients for the longest time, but I've started to get a little bit better at it. And what I usually do is just brushing the color from side to side and working on very small sections. So for example, now that I added this more vibrant blue in the top, the next layer I added just a bit of white to that color, and the next layer I added some more white again, and then I added just pure white. So you have a better chance at succeeding when you do it in very small sections canvas instead of working on this huge surface all in one go. And just a little heads up, I'm going to be jumping around a bit in the next step, so bear with me. After I was happy with the sky at this point, I got back to the clouds, adding more vibrant tones to them as well. I was mixing some magenta, scarlet, and bluish violet to add to the top of the rounded top edges of the clouds. And again, jumping around a bit, and at this point I decided to add more vibrant tones to the sky with white, violet, blue, magenta, and black, again blending it to the white. I think this turned out so pretty and works really well with all the warm tones of the landscape, and I'm really happy I decided to just brighten this color up a bit because again, it was looking very gray before. Overall, when I'm blending, I also want to make sure that my paint is on the drier side. It doesn't mean that I'm using it straight off the tube, but I'm not adding water as much as I would normally if I would just coat the area with paint. Now, after all that jumping around, I finally got back to the clouds and slowly started adding some more warmer tones to them while painting the lower sections of the clouds. First, I started by adding some more red tones to that purple paint, and then later on I started adding a little bit more yellows until it became very, very warm yellow in the bottom. I also painted some wispy clouds on top of the bigger one with the same lighter purple tone, just because this bubble-shaped cloud just looked a bit cartoonish by itself, and I think these little wispy clouds on the sky also balance the top of the painting really nicely. For the bottom of the cloud, I added some white and the two yellows to make it look even warmer and orangey to accentuate the golden sunset look, especially right over that horizon line. I also added a few almost white wispy clouds to the top of the sky. I actually forgot to press record, so you cannot see that part, but basically I was doing pretty much exactly the same as I did with the purple wispy clouds as well. I just thought that this painting just needed something more in the top there, and I think that it turned out really nice. After I was done with the sky, I moved onto the pathway where I mixed scarlet, yellow ochre, and black. For this pathway, I mainly used 3 different colors, the middle shade for the base, then mixing white and yellow ochre for little highlights, and lastly for the shadows, especially closer to the edge of the pathway on the left, I mixed more black to the base color. I tried to keep all the details more loose and simple by just adding in those 3 tones first and blending them to each other a bit. Later, I added a few sharper details with a smaller brush, but I wanted to work on the fields before that. Again, I'm using the Filbert brush to add all of these details for the pathway here because it really forces me to not be as detailed. If you have brushes that are just too small, it's easy to start working on the final details already at this point, even though it would be more beneficial for you to just get the base colors done. So I think that choosing a bigger brush for these bigger elements, especially here in the beginning, is very valuable and a very good thing to do to force you to focus on the bigger picture at this point. Next, I started painting the field around the pathway. I mixed an olive green and black together and started from the lowest sections on both sides with the darkest green colors, slowly lightening the colors as we go up. Also adding in lots of yellow to make the top of the field really warm in tone, so it looks like the setting sun is really coloring the field in the most beautiful golden tones. I sometimes use a bit of white when I lighten up my green color mixes, but mostly I'm using yellow because it makes the color lighter and still keeps it vibrant and warm. White color sometimes dulls the mixes a bit more, so it doesn't work for all colors and all paintings. In my spring lesson we used a lot of white, but since I want to keep the colors as warm as possible, for this painting the yellow undertones just fit the best. While I said I don't like to often use white, since we are working with such warm yellow tones in the top of this field, I wanted to make a cleaner mix by just adding some yellow tones and white together, just to take these yellow spots to the next level by adding a very warm, clean yellow tone to the top. After adding all of the tones for the flower field, I still darkened the edges of the pathway with more black mixed into the brown tones. This pathway looked initially dark enough, but after adding the other colors around it, it clearly didn't have enough contrast yet, so sometimes you just have to go back to an area you thought was already finished. Like I did before, I of course went in and blended these darker shades to the pathway as well with the same Filbert brush to not have these super sharp, out of place black areas in my pathway. And talking about that, I also darkened the edges of the fields as well to create some more depth and contrast. As you can see, we have all kinds of different tones in the field, but I'm not blending them together as much to keep that more organic look of tall grass. While we talked about blending and creating a gradient in the sky when we were painting it first, when I'm blending areas in the pathway and in the field, I'm not blending them as smoothly as you can see. I'm really just going in between these two different colors with my damp brush and just slightly blending them to each other so we don't have those super sharp edges of these colors that I have added, but I'm also making sure that they just look a little bit more realistic so we don't have these very smooth blends between two colors. But next I started working on some more intricate details with a size 2 long round brush and the same darker green tone. I started adding little lines for grasses, and with this darker tone I'm focusing on the darker spots on the field as well. And what I mean by that exactly is that I'm basically extending those darker areas on top of those lighter spots by adding these longer grasses on the edges of the darker areas in the fields, if that makes any sense. I'm bending the grass on top of the edges of the pathway as well in some spots to make it look more natural and imperfect. Just basically making sure that the field is also spilling on top of the pathway with some loose grasses here and there. For the lighter parts of the flower field, I'm mixing white, lemon yellow, and olive green and adding some more curved grass with a small brush. When painting grass, I try to have a very relaxed grip of my brush to create the grass more effortlessly, and I often paint the individual grass strokes from the root to the tip of the grass to have more pressure in the bottom and less pressure in the top to make the tip a little bit sharper. When I'm painting the lighter colored grass, I'm still trying to keep it only slightly lighter than the background so we don't have these white lines on top of very dark areas. I'm trying to keep everything as natural and realistic as I can, and to get that result, using a thin brush also helps a lot so the grass isn't too blocky and thick. I also left the back of the field mostly blank without any individual grass strokes because you won't be able to see those anyway. If you're looking at a flower field and you're looking at these areas that are very far away from you, you're not going to be able to see these individual thin grass strokes anyway. So leaving it blank just made a little bit more sense. When I was happy with the field, I added a few dotted details for the pathway just to add some more defined shapes to it with a darker brown paint. And still before adding flowers to the field, at this point I decided to paint some trees to the back of the field with olive green, yellow ochre and black. I just used my small brush to make a tree line very loosely to separate the orange sky and field as the colors were very similar to each other. With this step, I tried to make sure that some of the trees were a little bit taller than others, so it just looks a little bit less perfect and symmetrical. Even though I already loved this painting as is, I wanted to add some white flowers to the field as well. I think white flowers are like my trademark at this point, but they just balance the scenery so nicely in my opinion. When I painted these flowers in the front, I made them a bit sharper, whereas in the back they are more bunched together and less distinct. I think these white flowers just make this landscape really dreamy and I love it so much. Again, like with the first class, we're really not making any specific flowers here. We're really just adding white little dotted areas next to each other and calling them flowers. And I think that with these kinds of more loose paintings, it just works really well. But of course, if you want to spend a little bit more time, you can make these into daisies, for example, in the absolute bottom of this painting, and just make them look a little bit more detailed. But with that, we are getting to the end of the summer landscape lesson. I really hope you enjoyed this workshop, and like I always say, most importantly, I hope you had fun recreating this painting. Join me next week for the next lesson with an autumn landscape painting tutorial. If you want to see more of my art in the meantime, you can find me on most social media platforms with the same name, TiinasDiary. Thank you so much for joining me today, and I hope to see you next week. Bye bye.